Good morning and welcome to the Low Art Museum's annual Art Basel Brunch and Lecture. My name is Jill Dupy and it is my pleasure and privilege to serve as the Beaux-Arts Director and Chief Curator at the Low here at the University of Miami. I have the pleasure today of introducing you to our guest of honor, Donald Sultan. Born in Asheville, North Carolina, Sultan studied at UNC Chapel Hill and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago before permanently settling in New York City. There he quickly became, and has since remained, a central figure in the contemporary art world. Sultan has enjoyed innumerable solo exhibitions around the world, and today his works are held in a number of notable public collections, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, the Tate Modern, and the Whitney. Sultan is also the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including honorary doctoral degrees from the Corcoran School of Art and the New York Academy of Art, as well as the University of North Carolina. In 2010, he received the North Carolina Award for the Arts, and the following year, a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Houston Fine Art Fair. Donald is perhaps best known for his large format works executed in readily available industrial materials, including tar, spackle, linoleum tile, and latex paint. The disaster paintings are no exception, executed as they are on a very large scale. Most, as you would have seen, measure 8 by 8, and are constructed out of tar and latex on linoleum laid down on masonite. Sultan is also remarkable for his deep knowledge of art and art history. This resonates throughout his work, which, the sign of a true master, are uniquely his own, while also referencing some of the greatest artists of the past 5 centuries, including Rembrandt, Zurbarán, Goya, Whistler, Manet, Carl Andre, and Gordon Matta Clark. This is, in no small part, why his works are such a marvelous fit for the Low Art Museum, which is committed to exploring contemporary culture through 5,000 years of art. Please won't you join me in welcoming our very special guest today, Donald Sultan.
I chose to put, is this okay? The mic is okay? I chose to put this painting up because Jill asked me not to really speak too much about the disaster painting, but to talk about newer work. And in order to do that, I wanted to make the connections between the works you see in the museum here and the works that I'm going to show you. I'm not showing you everything that I've done, but just a range of it leading into the newest work. But this work was done sort of as I was transitioning a little bit out of the disaster paintings and focusing a little more on the floral series. So this one, which is called Oranges in a Disaster Pot, was a way of taking the horrific disaster pictures, in this case it was the sinking of a ferry in the Netherlands, and turn it into a flower pot. And then I put oranges in it, which is kind of funny that I'm showing it in Florida. But it was a transitional period. The flowers were all done sort of at the same time as the disaster pictures, and they referenced the similar ideas. They were about structure and disintegration. They were about manufacturing and gesture, and they were addressing issues of life and death and passing away. So the idea of taking these disasters and turning them into tourist pots, I thought was a nice way to sort of cap it off. So I made this when I was living in Paris, and I had made a silk screen, large silk screen, of the disaster painting called Ferry, which you can see in the book, and screened it over the whole painting after I'd scraped the tar off, and then proceeded to put in the oranges and the leaves and do the same treatment that I did in the disaster pictures. So you just see this kind of paradoxical view of 2 different images. This one was an earlier flower picture, which I used as the pot, the architectural detail of this house I had in the south of France, the balustrade, and I turned that urn shape into a flower pot. And I used flowers that you would find in a street, Korean deli, geraniums and bluebells and things like that, Scotch grass. They followed the smokestacks and fire, and the pots represented the smokestacks of the industrial paintings, and the flowers represented the kind of chaotic flow of fire. So that's part of that group. Here's another version where I took a silk screen and I went to Chinatown and bought a Chinese pot and screened that on the colors, and then stuffed it full of yellow roses and rubbed it all down, and they drip and run, and you have this kind of connection between the gesture, the yellow of fire, and the reproduction, the mass production of what would have been probably a cultural vase 800 years ago, but now just a tourist knockoff. This one I took out of the back of a Manet painting, Matisse painting. And in the painting by Matisse, there was just a tiny, tiny little flower pot. In the front, there was a table and probably some goldfish on it or something. But I decided to take that out and blow it up and use the gesture, the kind of cocky gesture of the vase, and stuff it with the flower, which is sort of the way he did it, although there was probably a little bit of more red in his. But this ended up, I gave it away as a gift to my ex-wife now, but it was more or less like cotton candy. And it's a very saucy flower arrangement. I really like it. And this one is, I had been doing charcoal drawings of black flowers, sort of like the black lemons and the sooty, gritty parts of the industrial pieces. And I made drawings of them, and I thought, well, what I would do is silk screen my own drawing and then reproduce that on the vase and contrast it to one that's drawn immediately right and dug out of the tar. So two different approaches to drawing, and one turning a drawing of mine into a kind of reproduction of itself. The shapes of the vases all were kind of, in a way, were always referencing architectural shapes. These were really the throats of the smokestacks that fire would belch out of that I used to watch when I was in Chicago from Gary, Indiana. And there's another one where I'd scraped all the tar away and left the vase and sort of cut it out of what was left. The gestures you see all around it are from sanding the tile to hold the tar. I guess I should address why I use linoleum and tar and why they're in squares. The reason for that was that I wanted to work primarily in architectural and hardware materials. I came out of working on the floor with abstract expressionism when I was younger. And when I moved to New York and I was working on paintings, trying to get the same kind of physical approach to them, so they were really physical objects instead of illustrations, I started looking at the Art de Povera artists and the site-specific artists, and I was working in construction, building lofts for other artists, and I was used to doing physical work. And I thought, well, rather than say like Gordon Matta Clark, who cut holes in the floors all the way through the buildings, I would cut a hole in the floor and then mount it on the wall. So I did it in sections because linoleum tile, which I discovered, was a good medium for me because it had the feeling of weight and strength, and I could actually cut into it and make the images I wanted to rather than taking a brush and illustrating them, which I was never as comfortable with. So I started doing everything in versions of 1 foot square. So everything that I made, and still do to a certain extent, is a variety of 1 foot squares magnified. Standard industrial materials, 4x8, 4x4, 1x1, 6x3, anything that you just buy readily. And I think I have a picture later on that shows the side, which is the back is made with, you can see them in these paintings if you look at them. They have stretcher bars you buy in an art school, an art store. You just put together, they're standard. And I wanted to emphasize that all of this work was painting. And then I used gas pipes to separate it from that to hang away from the wall so that you could see the architecture of the wall the painting was hung on, so the building participated, like the floor of the building could have been linoleum. And also the fact that these could be platforms and they were theatrics. I spent a lot of time in the theater, and the title of my first book of these kind of paintings was called The Theater of the Object. And it's really about all of the theater and the intellect and the interplay that happens between paintings and viewer. This one is called Gladiolas in a Glass Vase. And it was just a way to simplify a simple vase, and the whole structure became visible, like the back of the structure became visible through the glass vase. And the free form drawing, it's just the oil stick that I use when I make the sketches on the painting to cut them out and make the flowers themselves. So it contains a lot of those gestures. This is the same thing, but I used the pot, and I found this in a magazine of Chinese pottery, and I thought, well, that's a nice pot. I made it also, originally it's blue, and when I used it, I had it reproduced, and I made it, screened it on the pot. Someone saw it and told me that it was actually a very rare Chinese vase, and the 5 claws of the dragon show that it was an imperial vase and extremely rare. And I had no idea about that, but I like that because now it's also extremely rare. This one is tulips in a pot. And I really, there's a story about my use of the tulips, which someone in the audience says they own one. Those were some of my first charcoal drawings that were sort of meant to be industrial and sooty. And I had been at a party on the Upper East Side when I first moved to New York, and I was gaining success. A collector invited us to dinner, and she had made a beautiful table, and in the center was a round vase with red tulips all just perfectly straight around the corner. I thought, that is just fantastic. So I went out and I bought tulips and I put them in the water, and this is what they did. And I tried to figure out how to make them straight. And so I asked her, I said, how did you get those straight? She said, I just put wire through the stem. And I thought, well, but I kind of like the idea of their rebellious quality, because it's one of the only cut flowers that when you put it in water, it keeps growing. So they do wander. And this one I put into a vase that someone had given me that was a sort of a deco steel vase. It was sort of space agey. So I thought, well, I'll take that slender little pedestal, and that'll be the industrial chimney, and I'll let these bursts of flowers just go the way they go. It's just gesture. And then when I was in the south of France, on the side of my building, there was these morning glories, and I decided that I would have these kind of outdoor growths. And the shape from the old lemons, I would change and put dots in the center. And I made some of these. I fell in love with this color. I was doing an iris, morning glory, and it came out that it turned the ultramarine blue into that perfectly electric blue. And I just fell in love with it. So I did a series of those images just because of the color. But again, these are just bursts. I thought of the connection to these really to Arthur Dove's foghorn paintings, where you just had this kind of sound, almost like looking down the barrel of a trumpet, which later I made a series of drawings called Trumpets. I think the next one, I'm not sure if I have that in here, but the leaves on these took the place of the flowers coming out of the pots. And it was sort of a nod to Jasper John's cross-hatching. And Richard Archwager, who was a very close friend of mine, did a lot of cross-hatching. So I thought I would just show that the leaves themselves make that kind of cross-hatching in drawing. And then I superimposed these almost musical on the side. You see almost the side of a trumpet. with this beautiful kind of pulsing blue. And that took me to say, I'm going to get out of the gesture now and go into just industrial, man-made objects that had not much to do with nature. So I thought, what would make the perfect image for using these industrial shapes, 8-foot square, 4-foot square again, you see everything being a system of squares. And I thought dominoes will do that because that's really what they are. And they are also a system, very much like the system that I used. So I got involved with the dominoes, taking the centers out of the morning glories and making the pips of the dominoes. This one is, when I had my first show in Mary Ryan, she had a window over the High Line. And she wanted to put this in the window so everybody could see it from the High Line. And I said, but Mary, that's 9/11. And so we put something else up. But it was not, this was made long before that. But this is also East and West because you have Chinese and you have Asian, you have European dominoes. And the ones are ivory with ebony and the others are ebony with white pips. So there's the two different kinds together. And this was the intermingling of the two. They're called sort of the East and West. There are 28 of each domino. And it made such a great pattern. This was really one of the first ones, 8 and 5. I mean, 3 and 5, made 8. But a lot of times when I start a new series, I'll just be one single image, and then it'll take off from there, because I never quite know where it's going to go. But you have really just latex, flat black paint against the black of the tar, and it's very smooth. And so you see it's divided into its squares as well. This was my nod to Mondrian's X. These were like the morning glories without the flower, and they made almost constellations. But in each of these, you'll see the piece of the domino that it would go to. So they're just put together. Of course, I didn't know how to play dominoes, so I didn't actually do it the right way. This is random, and these were about cramming as many dominoes as I could as if they were held in by the edges of the painting. And this is yellow peppers, and this related to similar, you see, to the dominoes. And also to an earlier pictures were street lights. And then there's oranges on a branch. And then I hung Chinese lanterns on the branch. I had these in my garden. I'd bought some of these little Chinese lanterns that are just muslin. And I liked the beauty of them. And I got interested in the No theater in Japan, and I'd made a series of these with the leaves of the Japanese pine, which were circular. And it's the only set in the No is the pine tree, and they're very fascinating. So actually, after I did the leaves, the circle leaves, I thought I would hang the lanterns on it. And the lanterns, they say things like happiness and good luck, and they're not so different from the vases. They're standard. They're hand painted, I think, but somehow they do it. There's nothing real about the flowers themselves. They're totally artificial. And I got really involved in making these. I thought they were just sort of like blown up balloons or very industrial lighting, but very fragile. Also, one of the things that the sides of the paintings do is to show you how the structure is so strong, but the image is just the thin layer on the surface. And that's a kind of metaphor for painting, that the meaning is incredibly fragile, and the structures can be quite strong. But as you see in the disaster paintings, even the strongest structures are abandoned and are destroyed. So it's a question of what is permanent, what is not permanent, and what is real strength and what is weakness. Things come and go. These are actually, if you leave them in the rain, they go. This one I wanted to mix the Chinese colors with the black and white colors. And when I showed these to my mother, oh, see, I'm going to go back. I sent her a card of the show where this was, and she called me back, and she said, I just love your pumpkins. Which I hadn't thought of, frankly. But. And then I took the flower out of the lantern, and I turned that very hard-edged flower into a kind of gesture again. So I decided that, and these began to get highly polished against a painted background on the tile. And I wanted to, the more I started to polish them, the more they started to become liquid. And I thought that such a nice idea to have a hard-edged gestural image, which is really has nothing to do with nature at all, and to turn it almost something so hard into something that visually looks liquid. So they get to be very abstracted. And this is dug into the tar, and it's just the image pulled right out of that lantern and made into its own separate abstraction. There you can see the side of the painting, which you can see in these disaster pictures if you pay attention. I wanted to show the side because they're all lifted off the wall. And I used to say that one thing all paintings had in common was the nail. So you can see how these are hung, and you can see the architecture of the building. And most of the buildings really are made of the same sorts of architectural images I use or materials I use, except I don't use cement. But linoleum, the tar is really what they use for repairing roofs and cracks. And the paint is really standard paint. I can use oil paint because I think of it as, I don't mix the paint. I just put it straight from the tube, so it's just like buying tar or buying any kind of caulking materials. And I use those, the colors, this blue was a more or less nod to the blue I use, the blue tiles I used. And then I thought, well, let's just take the oranges and take the morning glories and let's make something really abstract and yet very realistic. Because I always believe that the closer you pare down something to its essence, the more it actually reflects the object that you're describing. So this is called Black Button. And I sanded the inside so you have the reveal of the button. The plaster is the white dots. And the edge I used a patinating black wax. So it's quite a large painting, and it's very hard. It's very hard. I wanted it to be really like a blown up object. But not to say so much button, but to say that's a very big, round, could be a gear even. And I had it in an exhibition, and a young artist came up and he looked at it and he said, well, there's a painting you can knock your head against. And that's true. So I did a number of these because they reminded me of Judd. They reminded me of minimalism. They reminded me of mechanism. They reminded me of Charlie Chaplin's 20th century. They reminded me of the gears. And also a button is an image that's meant to be used to reveal things rather than to see. It's also something that Southern kids in the Appalachians, their parents used to sew extra buttons into their clothing. So if they lost a button, they always had one that the nurse could put back on there. And the colors I used were basically completely unnatural. There's no natural color of this aqua. Most of the colors I've used from the beginning are still the same colors. Every now and then I will veer from that, as I have now in the new ones, which are moving now into this. This is called 28 Flowers, and it's all the colors of flock. Flocking is the kind of a fabric you blow onto objects. You probably are familiar with them if you've seen a bobblehead dog in the back of a car with that fuzzy surface. That's what this is. And this is really a color chart. But I'd rather make them than squares like a Kelly or a Losa or something like that. I made them into the floral image that I was using and standardized it. So that's all 28 flocked colors. And I use it as a reference. This is at the Virginia Museum now. I use them as references for the newer works. This one's kind of hard to see in this picture, but those are navy blue, dark blue flowers, all the same, with a very shiny, polished black center. And this is 6 aquas. I like to think of them, they could also be railings, a decoration on railings. Then I decided to use the flocking like I did for the tar. The tar originally came from, when I started putting it down, the first ones I made images of steers because it looked like a hide. And then the flocking, I thought, well, that's a fabric, so let's start using the buttons to be on top of a herringbone or on top of a fabric. So I did those, and these are sort of a fabric blue. And this has taken away everything but just the image of the button flower and the the masonite, which everything is put on. So that's a very pared down image. And this is really one of the first ones where you can see the outline of the flower. You can see the sanding of the masonite. You see the wood filler that we use to fill the nails to go underneath everything else. And then the dots are put down there, glued on there. And this is really the essence of every single painting, one way or another. Then I decided that I would instead of doing herringbone and fabrics like that, I would do paintings, modernist paintings. So this is called Broadway Boogie Woogie. And I put a button-down Boogie Woogie on the linoleum. And then I took the modernist tenet and I made the buttons on these almost like a dress in the background with a button on it. And I started thinking of, well, now we can just use like fashion, just appropriate great art and put a button on it. And so that's what I've been doing. And this is the new work. And the lines are the masonite. I try to keep them basically as clean. I don't use tar so much anymore now. I make them basically as clean and pared down as I can. And this is what I've been doing. I decided also using the modernist things to come up with colors, I would use the paint jobs on Bel Airs, the 59 Bel Air cars, and some Coupe de Villes, because the color combinations are quite startling. And so that's what I've been doing now. That's the new work. This is just the masonite, and this is a lot of little black flowers with using the dominoes, as you saw before, the idea of the dominoes and varying the dots. So they operate almost like a gear. They flip back and forth, and they stay straight. They're highly, they're very big and strong images. The black is very, very shiny, so you can almost see your face in it. And this is pretty much it. That's it. So if anybody would like to ask a question or two, as long as we don't have too many, I'll be happy to answer them. I hope I answered most questions, but I'm sure there's always something.
And I would just like to ask you to raise your hand very high if you have a question, and we'll bring the mic to you. And while we're waiting for the first question, Donald, I'll warm you up by asking, could you talk a little bit about how your images deny the edges of the frame? So many of your works, including the edges of the leaves and the lanterns in particular, clearly overlap, and it's quite a beautiful effect. But could you talk about the ideas that are driving that decision?
Well, the edges of the paintings, the edges of the paintings being uneven is really a result of the work that I put on the surface. If I'm putting tar on the surface, when I spread it, it catches the edge of the blade and it rolls off the edge. If I'm using plaster, it does the same thing. So in this one particularly, since we're using flocking, you won't have that edge like that. It'll be squared. They're all process. They're really the result of process. Also, I guess from the beginning, most of the images that I used, I wanted to be images that would be thought of as continuous. Like the very early works, I had part of an image seen through a window, which implied that you were in a house looking out, and it was more to the world than what you saw in the window. And then most of the other works were pieces of a larger frame. So everything goes to the edge and beyond. And it's a little bit like abstract expressionism, where you were in the middle, but it didn't have an edge. And I liked that idea because I didn't like the idea of framing the painting itself. I've never liked the idea of having a square border inside and then the image inside. If there's going to be broken, it should be broken by a frame or by the wall itself. But the process determines the edge of the painting.
Were these oil paintings or?
Well, these are a kind of yes, they're all they're all industrial paint. The black is a sign paint, and the first one I showed you, the button, was the first time I polished and had a plastic shine to it. I wanted the buttons to feel like I was making, they like buttons, like they were hard, plastic, unmanufactured objects. So when I started to use the black and painted it on there, I tried to do it by just painting it. But every time we would do that, there would be little specks of dust in it. And I called a furniture maker and I said, well, how do you do a lacquered piano or a piece of furniture like that? And they said, well, we use an sealed chamber. I said, what is sealed chamber? There's no such thing as a sealed chamber. So I was talking to a guy in North Carolina, I believe, and he has a woodworking, sells woodworkers' materials. And he said that he has a series of little sandpaper grits that he used to make model cars when he painted them. And he could do it so they looked like a real car. He could polish it so fine. And so he sent me this. It's like, I think there are 32 different grits that we use on these. And if you're good at it, you could polish scratches out of your glasses. And so we do that. So these things, there's no bubbles in these. And they're very reflective. And they're hard. And they serve the function that I want. The round buttons, I thought by changing them into more decorative ones, I've suited the idea of using them as fashion buttons on modernism. But round buttons I thought would be good too. I did a series of round buttons. I just showed you 3 or 4 images of it, but I did quite a few of them. Yeah.
So I have to ask, because I study theater, and you mentioned that you like theater, and then you just mentioned about a frame, and I wanted you to comment on how getting rid of the frame is a little bit like getting rid of the proscenium arc in classical theater, and how that interpolates the audience. If you see that as part of the give and take between the artist, the artwork, and the audience.
Yeah, well, classical theater with a proscenium is pretty much the history of art up to a certain point, because that's the window idea of art, which was broken by Pollock, really. And having grown up actually being involved with theater and I did a lot of apprenticeships doing stage design and things like that. I decided that the platforms were really like, you could say it was a boxing ring, or you could say it was a flat boards of the theater. But really, since it's one person's dialogue, it made sense to me to have just like a freestanding spot. And it just made sense, really. Sometimes somebody will buy a big painting and they'll think the side is not pretty for their house, so they'll put it in a frame, which is, a box frame of some kind. Well, that's called taming the monster, right? And that's the idea. I mean, you can put pretty much anything inside a big frame with glass on it. It'll look pretty good. But it's also safe, right? It doesn't come out and bite you. Somebody else had a question back there.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the snippets of art that you're taking from other artists.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little of electronic music where a riff is taken from a musician established and then other music. What are the logistics to that? Do you have to get permission or?
Well, I don't do it exactly, more or
Okay.
less. I don't. They just are ideas that come from that. I don't think anybody, there's not a reproduction of an Arthur Dove or a Manet or anything like that. But the reference is there. In the book, you'll see, in the disaster book, you'll see a painting of a bunch of destroyer artillery guns firing just with the fire coming out. And that was, with the colors, was a reference to Goya's 3rd of May and to Manet's execution of Maximilian, and how in Goya's the victim is the central figure, and in Manet's it's the mechanized firing squad seen from the back. And in this one, you don't see the victims or the people. You only see the guns. They fire bullets that are the size of Volkswagens 40 miles away and land on people's cities. And so the disconnect between what you're doing and the results of what you're doing can be quite enormous, as we've seen with shock and awe. The distance of watching these things on television, being from the air, is very different when we think shock and awe, but by the way, there are people down there. So the idea being that, the further removed you keep going from these acts, the less you really know what you're doing. And so I referenced that, but I was doing the tulip drawings, and I was looking at a Manet exhibition, and a friend of mine said that the little lemon of Manet wasn't so different from the shape of the tulip bulb. So I just took that out and made my lemon paintings. But it came from that, but it wasn't done the same way. It was pared down. It wasn't even the same shape because I made my own shape out of it. But I like the connection between all of these different things. And a lot of the disaster pictures have references to Turner and to a number of other images of Jasper's heads and targets. And, we're all involved in the same enterprise in some way, but in different ways. Yeah, somebody.
As I understand it, the disaster series was during a dedicated period of time, if I recall, 11 years. I was wondering, as a result of the election, if maybe you wanted to revisit that series.
Yeah. It's funny you should mention that. Well, people have asked me to do that, but I've been asked about that, and I've been gathering some images. But when I was actually at the opening of the exhibition here, we had a man from the German consulate here, and he asked me, why did I do Auschwitz and not Aleppo? And I said, well, in 1982, there wasn't any Aleppo, by the way. But I thought that if I was going to revisit it, maybe I would consider doing Aleppo. But we have so much of this now, imagery, that I'm not sure I have that much to add to it. I wasn't making specific points about specific places. The Auschwitz one was done, from '82, I think. And it was really about, they wanted to turn it into a museum, but it was occupied by Carmelite nuns who wouldn't leave. And so that's why there was nothing, it was just sort of dilapidated, and finally the German government just moved them out of there. So I thought all these things that happen that are so important, they change over time. And so when I started thinking about redoing disaster paintings, which I'm not sure, I'm sort of involved in this now, and I don't know where this will take me. But I saw some pictures of the smog in Tehran, where people can't breathe and I thought, that's an interesting picture. And I've seen some other images that, not so much that Aleppo or some of that, but images that, strike me as being sort of urgent because of the long-range impact as well, not just because it's a picture of destruction. Because a lot of the disaster pictures are really about the things that are effective that you can't see. I mean, what happened to the plants? And what happened to the factories, the fires? What started that? And you have the fire, and you have air, and you have all these things that are involved in them. It's not really about specific places, although there's one in there called Airstrike, which was the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. And it was just bombing, raining down on people, the shadows and things like that. But you can't see the person firing. So it's just, it wasn't specific, but it was just sort of a universal. Is that it? Oh, yes. This lady has some. Yeah, you can speak. It's not that big of an auditorium.
With your interest in theater and your background that you alluded to, are you showing an interest now in perhaps doing backdrops for theater and costumes for ballet?
Well, I had thought of it. David Mamet and I were very close friends, and we always were going to do sets together. And I had done something in the 80s, and Harvey Lichtenstein, who ran the BAM Theater, was opening the Majestic, and he said, why don't you get David to do a Shakespearean production, and you'll do the sets and costumes. So I said to David, they've offered us this theater, why don't we do that? And he said, Donald, it's in Brooklyn. So there was always something that didn't happen. We were going to do one thing, and then something else happened. And frankly, a lot of the plays he does, I wouldn't serve him well. If it was going to be a Shakespearean production or something like that, I kind of know what I would do. But for a standard theater set, I wouldn't be the right person to do that. It's like when they asked me to do a drawing for their book cover. If I don't already have the drawing that I'd made myself, I find that my drawings that I make, they're really not very good. There are better people to do illustration than me. So, thank you.